This web lecture video is on the post-war era, part 2, the clash of ideologies. In part 1, we discussed the Keynesian economic policies that were followed in the 1950s and 1960s. They were based on the idea that governments could affect the path of the economy using monetary and fiscal policy. Keynes had argued that recessions happened when people save money instead of spending, and the savings don't get invested by businesses in, say, factories and machines. Keynes argued that people will spend and invest when they are feeling optimistic, which he called their animal spirits. Keynes believed that if people and businesses are not spending, then the government must do so instead. The government can run a budget deficit by spending more and taxing less. That is a fiscal policy stimulus. It can also use monetary policy. Keynes criticised classical economics that said that money had no real impact on the economy. This is known as the classical dichotomy, that is, the idea that real variables like, say, employment or output are independent of monetary variables. Printing more money would only increase prices. Keynes, however, argued that the real side of the economy was connected to the monetary side. If governments can print more money, increasing the money supply, then to encourage people to hold on to the extra cash, rather than use it to, say, buy bonds instead, the interest rate must fall so the demand for money increases. The lower interest rates reduce the cost of borrowing for businesses, leading to higher investment, higher production and higher employment. However, Keynes argued that fiscal policy was much more powerful than monetary policy to stimulate the economy. And only in the long run, when the economy reaches full employment, Keynes argued, does government demand management push up prices. But in the 1970s, many developed countries were experiencing both high unemployment and high inflation, known as stagflation, and the Phillips curve, therefore, that was central to Keynesian economics, had broken down. So economists considered other explanations for what was going on. These developments paved the way for a new economic and political philosophy. On the left we have the public sector strikes in Britain, which we saw before in the winter of discontent when rubbish was not being collected, and on the right we have the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Now Thatcher was a big fan of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek's basic position was that more government means less freedom. His argument was that if the government itself owns big industries, like say in energy or transport, or paid for services like schools and hospitals using taxpayers' money, or set prices for certain goods, even within a mixed economy framework that is not a socialist system, then the government is making decisions on behalf of people that take away their own ability to choose based on their own preferences. Hayek argued that people should have economic freedom where they can decide what to do for themselves. He wrote a book to warn people of this called A Road to Serfdom. He said we could end up with complete control by government, such that we end up like medieval serfs, peasants controlled by a lord who are not allowed to make their own decisions. But although Hayek was an ultra-free market economist, even he accepted some government spending would be needed in the economy, for example to support the unemployed, and that it would not threaten freedom if done sparingly. Hayek emphasised the power of free markets to deliver prosperity. He blamed Keynesian economic policies, which he called easy money, for causing crises. Hayek also said that if you have a boom, then it may be followed by a bust, which will be very painful to recover from, and that Keynesian demand management policies would not help over the longer run because they would only paper over the problems in the short term and potentially make problems worse in the longer run. Hayek's view was about empowering markets, containing government spending, making sure that monetary policy isn't too loose, all of which are the opposite to Keynesian demand management policies, and placing the emphasis on the structure of the economy, that is to say the supply side of the economy. So if you have any government intervention, it should be in making sure the supply side of the economy is more competitive. Now Margaret Thatcher was a big fan of Hayek, and he came back into fashion during the time Thatcher was in power, but it was very contentious in the early 1980s. The first Thatcher government reduced spending, tightened monetary policy, increased interest rates. the exchange rate appreciated, so the pound increased in value against other currencies, and there was a severe recession compounded by another oil price shock as OPEC increased oil prices. Similar policies were also implemented in the US by Ronald Reagan.
It's been half a year since the election that charged all of us in this government with the task of restoring our economy. And where have we come in these 6 months? Inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, has continued at a double-digit rate. Mortgage interest rates have averaged almost 15% for these 6 months, preventing families across America from buying homes. There are still almost 8 million unemployed. The average worker's hourly earnings, after adjusting for inflation, are lower today than they were 6 months ago, and there have been over 6,000 business failures. 6 months is long enough. The American people now want us to act, and not in half measures. They demand, and they've earned, a full and comprehensive effort to clean up our economic mess. Because of the extent of our economy's sickness, we know that the cure will not come quickly, and that even with our package, progress will come in inches and feet, not in miles. But to fail to act will delay even longer and more painfully the cure which must come. And that cure begins with the federal budget. And the budgetary actions taken by the Congress over the next few days will determine how we respond to the message of last November 4th. That message was very simple. Our government is too big and it spends too much.
In both the US and the UK, many traditional industries went into decline, so there was a period of deindustrialization. In the US, the Rust Belt was created in the early 1980s, and in the UK, the northern industrial cities in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland suffered greatly. It was a devastating shock and a very controversial policy. At the time these policies were being put into place and the consequences were becoming apparent, many economists disagreed. 364 economists wrote to the Times to protest against the government's economic policy. They said there is no basis in economic theory or supporting evidence for the government's belief that by deflating demand they will bring inflation permanently under control and thereby induce an automatic recovery in output and employment. So they were advocating the use of Keynesian demand management policies that were discredited in the eyes of the Thatcherites by the recent events of the 1970s, so by the stagflation that we saw earlier. So we can return to this earlier slide to see what happened in terms of GDP growth. After 1979 you can see there is a steep recession, but then the economy did bounce back and growth recovered in the UK to nearly 5% in the late 1980s. So although there was a severe recession, growth did bounce back afterwards. Margaret Thatcher and also Ronald Reagan in the US followed the monetarist theories developed by Milton Friedman that brought money back to the centre of economics. This is a picture of Milton Friedman on the slide. In the late 1960s and in the 1970s, Friedman popularised the quantity theory of money, which was an old theory that had been invented back in the 1920s by Irving Fisher. The quantity theory of money is based on the identity that the stock of money in circulation M multiplied by the velocity of circulation, the speed money is exchanged, V, equals the nominal value of output, that is, the volume of transactions T multiplied by the average price of transactions P. Thus, the flow of monetary expenditures equals the nominal value of output or GDP. If real output T is determined by supply-side characteristics, such as the innovations taking place in the economy, the level of taxes, how markets are operating, and if V is fixed, so the velocity is stable, then to keep inflation low, we need to keep the growth of the money supply low as well. So the quantity theory of money identity became an economic theory that unemployment and output are determined by structural aspects of the economy, and monetary policy should be dedicated to keeping inflation low. Monetarism was a complete shift away from Keynesian demand management policies. Keynes thought that there is not a stable velocity, V, so the link between money and national income is only weak. Friedman, however, argued that velocity is fairly stable, so there is a strong effect of money on national income in the short run. An increase in the supply of money increases spending, and in turn leads to higher production and employment and higher wages. However, after a while, prices will also start to rise. People will realise their real wages have not actually increased, and so they'll work less, and the economy will return to its initial lower level of employment. That's why the Phillips curve broke down. Friedman argued that in the Great Depression, the problem was the fall in the money supply, not the fall in spending, as Keynes argued. But Friedman also argued that if governments try to manipulate the money supply to affect economic outcomes, then the effects will not take place instantly. By the time they do have an effect, the economy might have changed direction. Therefore, the government may end up doing more harm than good. Instead, with the velocity of circulation of money constant, Friedman argued that governments should commit to a fixed rate of growth in the money supply in line with the growth rate of economic output. So Thatcher and Reagan followed Friedman's advice. They tried to tightly control the money supply in order to bring down inflation. They also followed Hayek's philosophy of reducing government intervention. Hayek argued that governments did not need to increase demand in the economy, which would only increase inflation and instability. Instead, governments should use supply-side policies that aim to increase what businesses are able to produce. For example, through market deregulation or reducing corporation tax, to encourage businesses to produce more and employ more workers. This slide summarises the main differences in the ideas of Hayek and Keynes. Hayek argues that we need to limit the growth of the money supply to contain inflation, which we can do by maintaining high interest rates, which will lead to exchange rate appreciation, which the Thatcher and Reagan governments implemented, leading to deindustrialisation. We need to reduce the size of the government budget deficit, and we should privatise the badly run state monopolies like telecommunications and railways, it was argued. So we need to deregulate as much as possible, and we also need to reduce union power, Hayek argued. So there was a weakening of union power. Now all of this was meant to fix the supply side of the economy. The aim was to increase the efficiency of production, increasing real output, and then use monetary and fiscal policy to reduce inflation. That was the opposite to the Keynesian view that had been in place since World War II, that the quantity theory of money was just an identity, they argued, the result of what happens within the economy, and so could not be used as a causal mechanism to change inflation or output. So using the quantity theory of money as a basis for economic policy was fundamentally incoherent. And as we've been discussing, Keynes argued for demand management policies. So for example, if unemployment is high, we need to loosen monetary policy, that is, reduce interest rates, leading to exchange rate depreciation, and you can't expect the economy to sort itself out on its own and get to a state of high and stable employment. So the UK and US started trying to control the growth of the money supply in order to reduce inflation. The idea was that if money was not going into the economy, prices cannot increase. However, how do you actually implement this policy? There are many different definitions of a money supply. M0 is notes and coins in circulation. Another definition is M1, which adds to M0 deposits in banks that you can have instant access to. M2 includes savings accounts you can access quickly, but people have in mind they are not for spending, like money in your current account. M3 adds long-term deposits you have to give notice to get hold of, and wholesale instruments not used by consumers but by professionals in markets. And M4 adds other financial instruments growing more slowly than M3 at that moment in time. In the mid-1980s, when governments were targeting the money supply, they tried targeting every one of these definitions of a money supply. First of all M0, then M1, and then the UK government skipped to M3, but they all started to grow much faster as the government started to target them. And that was embarrassing because the whole economic philosophy was to control the growth of the money supply in order to keep inflation low. But whenever the government targeted the growth in the money supply, it started to accelerate. By the mid-1980s, M3 was growing at a double-digit rate, about 15% a year or so. If you take the quantity theory of money seriously, that would imply inflation was going to rapidly accelerate. So the government tried adding in slower growing instruments to M4. But when they targeted M4, that also started to accelerate. So you can see the whole definition of M4 was just an attempt to create a definition of a money supply which was growing more slowly. So there wasn't really a lot of theory going on behind the definition of M4. Why was the government so obsessed with finding a monetary measure that wouldn't misbehave when it got targeted? Well, the theory was that it was important to take away the discretion that is implied by the Keynesian approach to managing the economy. So Keynesian macroeconomics sees government as able to fine-tune the economy. For example, if you want a bit more employment or a bit less inflation, the government has the discretion to adjust fiscal and monetary policy in order to achieve this. But discretion was being used by politicians to increase employment before a general election. So there is empirical evidence that supports the existence of what is called a political business cycle, whereby governments cut interest rates and increase spending before an election in order to try and increase employment. But then after the election, the government has to tighten policy as the deficit gets too big and inflation starts to rise. The attraction of targeting the money supply was that it restrains this discretionary behaviour, and it also had the intellectual credibility of the monetary theory behind it. But when monetary targeting didn't work, not only in the UK but in many other countries, there was an argument we needed a different rule instead. We still needed something to constrain the discretion governments had to manipulate the economy in order to get themselves re-elected. There have been a whole series of rules that have been used over time, which is shown on the right-hand side of the slide. And on the left, we have the theory part, that is to say why we think it is important to have a rule rather than policy discretion. Friedman argued that even if you thought it was desirable and possible to exercise discretionary monetary and fiscal policy and have an effect on the economy, it was too hard to predict because of what he called long and variable lags. This is an idea that we touched on earlier. So, for example, if the government changes interest rates, the process through which that operates and affects the money markets and money supply, and in turn affects behaviour in the economy, and then ultimately affects the outcomes you care about, that whole process is unstable and unpredictable, and it can take a long time. So therefore it is not amenable for use by policymakers. Policymakers could ultimately end up making things worse because they respond too quickly without waiting for the effects of earlier policies to play through. So there is substantial policy uncertainty. In the 1970s, monetarism was augmented by a set of theories in economics during what is sometimes called the rational expectations revolution. When people have rational expectations, they make predictions about what is going to happen using all available information. And that means people are no longer surprised. For example, the Phillips curve holds in the short run because if you boost demand, it increases production and wages, and therefore people work more, increasing employment and pushing up inflation. But when people realise that with more inflation, their real wages have actually not gone up, they then start working less, reducing employment. So people are being caught out by the rise in inflation, which they did not anticipate. However, economists such as Robert Lucas developed and applied the hypothesis of rational expectations. If people are rational, they are no longer caught out. They will immediately anticipate the government's intentions when boosting demand. They will foresee that their higher wages will simply be eroded by higher prices and that their real wages will not therefore increase, and as a result they will not work more. So the government actually cannot boost the economy even in the short run. The only effect it will have is to increase inflation. The economic policy therefore that governments should implement is simply to try and keep inflation low by not printing too much money or spending too much money. Lucas also believed that markets quickly reach an equilibrium. So if there is unemployment, wages will quickly fall and firms will therefore hire more workers. Therefore, people who are out of work are unemployed out of choice, and due to rational expectations, the government could not increase employment. And that became known as the new classical economics, because it revived the idea from classical economics that the economy would quickly adjust to eliminate unemployment. But this is very controversial. Do markets really adjust so quickly? Why did we have such a long period of high unemployment during the Great Depression, for example? Further developments included the work by Kideland and Prescott, who found that rational expectations lead to time inconsistency. Governments may make a promise to keep inflation low because they know that Keynesian demand management policies will simply lead to increased inflation. However, people won't believe the government's promise, because if they do believe the government's promise, then the government can suddenly surprise everyone by boosting the economy in the short run to increase employment, which is in the government's interests when a general election is approaching. Because people then expect prices to rise, they demand higher wages, and we end up with higher inflation anyway. So at the heart of the concept of time inconsistency is the idea that governments cannot commit to a policy in the long run, even though it is actually in the government's own interests to do so, because as time progresses, the government does not have the incentive to wait for the policies that have long-term beneficial impacts to take effect. Therefore, Kideland and Prescott's analysis showed that policy discretion actually reduces the power of government to carry out the best policy. The government's actions are in effect self-defeating. They argued that instead of having policy discretion, governments should follow a rule decided in advance. In addition, a class of new classical macroeconomic models were developed called real business cycle theory. This theory suggests that business cycle fluctuations are efficient responses to exogenous changes in the real economic environment. That is to say, efficient responses to supply-side productivity shocks. And so governments should concentrate on long-run structural policy changes and not intervene through discretionary fiscal or monetary policy designed to actively smooth out economic fluctuations. Therefore, there has been a whole set of theoretical developments that pave the way for rules-based economic policies in the 1980s. But in fact, we've had a sequence of rules-based policies over time. After the war, there was still a gold standard operating through the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates, giving you a rules-based framework, but that broke down as we saw earlier. Monetary growth targets were later introduced as the next rules-based framework, but that didn't work very well and also broke down. After that, the Conservative government introduced the medium-term financial strategy. The medium-term financial strategy was launched in 1980 in the UK and still had an element of monetary growth targeting. It aimed to reduce the growth in the money supply from around 15% to about 4 to 8%, and also to reduce public sector borrowing. It was an attempt to set a rules-based framework for economic policy. However, it was then abandoned when Britain joined the exchange rate mechanism. In the exchange rate mechanism, the pound was pegged to the Deutschmark. To keep the pound's value, the government had to keep interest rates high. But that meant the costs of borrowing were very high in the UK, for example, for households with mortgages. Speculators like George Soros started to believe that the government could not maintain the peg, and they expected, therefore, the pound to fall in value. And so they began to sell pounds, putting pressure on the peg. The government tried to defend the peg and spent billions on buying up pounds, and it also tried to increase demand for pounds by putting up interest rates even further. Chancellor Norman Lamont announced that interest rates would increase to 15%, so spectacularly high levels of interest rates. But speculators kept selling, so ultimately the government had to abandon the peg. George Soros made about £1 billion at the UK taxpayers' expense. After the ERM, the UK needed another set of rules, so like many other countries, the UK adopted an inflation target. And the UK's monetary policy today still involves inflation targeting. The inflation target involves a Taylor rule, which is a rule for how you adjust the interest rate to deliver the inflation rate you want, given what is happening in the economy. So we have had a succession of rules-based frameworks for macroeconomic policy since Keynesian demand management was abandoned from 1980 onwards. This graph demonstrates how hard it is to get the money supply to behave. It goes back to 1983, just after the start of monetary targets, and it shows M4, which is the broadest measure of a money supply. We started off at 15% growth in M4, and rather than decreasing to 4 to 8% as the Chancellor wanted, it accelerated to 20%. Then it plunged in 1991 to 1992 because there was another big recession across the OECD, and then it picked up again. Afterwards it was volatile and then increased again in the 2000s. And if we had shown M0 or M3, we would also observe very big swings. So why are there these big swings in the growth in the monetary aggregate? The answer ties to the economic cycle, the level of economic activity in the economy and the number of transactions that take place. But also financial innovation plays an important role. So in the 1980s, the money supply was increasing substantially, but inflation, as we saw earlier, was actually decreasing. And that seemed, therefore, to undermine the quantity theory of money. So if you think back to the quantity theory of money equation, MV equals PT, how could there be a big increase in the money supply, but prices actually were falling? Well, the answer is that there was a boom in real output T. So in the mid to late 1980s, T was growing very fast. But also, the velocity of money, the speed at which money exchanges hands, was very, very unstable. And that was due to financial innovations. In the 1980s, there was a tremendous amount of financial innovation, both in the wholesale markets, so the stock exchange, as shown in the bottom left of this slide, but also in the retail financial markets as well. In 1986, the Thatcher government introduced what became known as the Big Bang, which is a reference to the sudden deregulation of the financial markets that took place in the UK, including, for example, the abolition of fixed commission charges. And there were similar but not quite so dramatic deregulation episodes in other countries as well. Deregulation of the financial markets led to an explosion in the growth of new financial instruments. In the diagram on the bottom right-hand side of the slide, there is the growth in terms of the number of contracts in derivatives markets. The volume of transactions taking place in financial markets increased massively. The broader monetary measures, such as M4 with different financial instruments included within them, had all this innovation going on in the background. And the story of derivative markets is very important because it played a major role in the financial crisis because banks did not know what risks they had taken on. They were so obscure through the derivative contracts. So all that was happening in the wholesale markets. In the retail markets, the cash machine was invented, first installed in the 1980s. Before that, to get cash out, you would have to queue up at the bank. And then the use of different credit cards and debit cards spread from the 1980s as well. So the rate of growth of M0, notes and coins only, likely has slowed substantially because people were increasingly using debit cards and credit cards to make payments rather than cash. So that is why you get the variations in the money supply growth, and the government was on the one hand deregulating financial markets, changing the velocity of money and changing the relationship between monetary growth and inflation, and on the other hand the government was trying to target the rate of growth in the money supply. So the government's own policy of deregulation of financial markets was undermining its own policy of targeting the money supply growth. Here we can see the effect that these policy decisions have had on the exchange rate. So this graph shows sterling's exchange rate against a range of other currencies weighted by how much trade the UK does with different countries. And there was a big decline in the value of the pound after the ERM crisis. It then recovered and was stable in the late 1990s. Then the pound fell again sharply during the financial crisis, because the UK has a lot of banks and is therefore very vulnerable to financial crises. Sterling then recovered until the Brexit vote and fell again. So over the long run, we can see the pound has tended to decline in value relative to other currencies in real terms. But the fact that sterling is so volatile suggests that the exchange rate is not a good framework for stability either, like targeting the money supply. In the 1990s, the UK, like many governments, switched to inflation targeting, in a sense because they had tried everything else. Monetary policy is then used to meet the target, and so there is a nominal anchor for monetary policy. But to enforce this rule, the government has to give up power over its central bank. So many countries, such as the UK, France and New Zealand, made their central banks independent and set targets for inflation. The inflation target is set by politicians, so by Parliament in the UK, and then the central bankers use monetary policy to meet the target. It is argued that the target shouldn't be zero, but a low and stable rate of inflation is needed to accommodate some frictions in the economy. And you can set the target in different ways. In the UK, we have a symmetric band around the target. Other countries have a ceiling. And you can have an asymmetric band if you care more about inflation being too high or too low. The central bank must be independent to resolve the time inconsistency problem. That is, to set stable expectations that there will be no attempt to exploit the short-term trade-off between inflation and unemployment. The institutional framework must give confidence that that will happen. So the central bank must be independent to ensure there is no political business cycle whereby there is an incentive to change policy before a general election in order to help the government get re-elected.
The government will set the inflation target, the Bank of England will be charged with the setting of interest rates, and it will do it through the Monetary Policy Committee. That will be the instrument for making the decision about interest rates. There is no membership of that for the Chancellor or Chief Secretary or anybody else. There is no politician involved in that committee at all. I think people will welcome the fact that we now have a government that is prepared to break from the dogmas of the past, to look at old assumptions and to look at them clinically and to make decisions that are in the long term and not simply for short-term political gain.
In 1995, when we were in opposition, I'd left the FT to work for Gordon Brown. He was the Shadow Chancellor. We met with Tony Blair, and I presented a paper saying the next Labour government should make the Bank of England independent in order to get the stability in the economy. And then, the Monday before the general election in 1997, Gordon Brown said to me in a hotel room in central London, he said, "I've been thinking about this. If we're going to make the Bank of England independent, we should move immediately. I don't want to get stuck in monthly meetings with the governor. We should just have the first meeting, make them independent, and let them get on with it."
Normal growth is fundamentally determined by sort of the fundamentals in the economy. How productive is your labor? How many machines have you accumulated? What's your rate of technological progress? And frankly, that's not something that monetary policy can affect. That's affected by other policies, by your educational system, things like that. So I think trend growth doesn't really matter what form of a central bank you have. It's where an independent central bank is so important is on price stability and on smoothing out business cycles.
28 countries now have inflation targets, including all of the G7 and many other OECD countries as well. But has the policy worked? Well, the rate of inflation has declined and has been low in many countries for a period of time, so that suggests that it has worked well. But is this due to the policy, or is it due to what is happening in the world economy anyway? So this is all about the demand side of the economy and policy, but there have also been a lot of changes on the supply side. So a lot of supply side innovations, new consumer goods, new inputs to production and components of products, which over time have declined in price. And that's partly due to innovation in technology, increasing the quantity of goods and reducing prices, but also because of trade. So China joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, for example, meant a big increase in the supply of clothing and other consumer goods at lower prices. So inflation targeting appears to have been a successful framework, but it is hard to distinguish between the role of policy and the demand side and the supply side conditions in contributing to the low rate of inflation we have been experiencing. What about the effect on GDP growth? Well, we can see in this graph there has been a long, slow decline in the rate of growth in GDP over time. So it hasn't increased at all recently. We have certainly not gone back to the 30 glorious years post-war. But growth did become much less volatile over time since the mid to late 1980s. So there was a period of economic stability which many economists called the Great Moderation. We didn't have a high rate of growth, but it was much more stable than it had been previously. So it was claimed that this was a success of policy. The abandonment of Keynesian demand management and discretionary policies, and instead using a rules-based framework, it was argued, led to an end to boom and bust economics. However, there was another contribution to stabilising GDP growth other than economic policy, and that was technology. So innovations in the production side of the economy and the rise of just-in-time production, so that companies did not have to hold on to big inventories of supplies of components anymore. They only needed, say, 1 to 2 days of components at a time. And the logistics system developed to get those components to companies just in time, as the name suggests. So previously, the inventories were one of the big contributions to the swings in GDP in the early part of this diagram. So when the economy slowed down, people produced less output, and so they just simply ran down their inventories and did not need to stock up as they usually would, amplifying the GDP cycle. Just-in-time production meant that these inventory swings effectively went away because manufacturers only needed 1 to 2 days of components at a time, and supermarkets, for example, would only need 1 day of supplies. And we can see this in the data. So this table shows data for the US, but it's a very similar story for the UK as well. And the columns give 3 different decades. The bottom of the 2 red circles shows the contribution of inventories to GDP growth volatility. And you can see it's much lower in the second 2 columns. The contribution of consumer spending to GDP volatility also declined, as shown by the upper red circle. Now, why might that have been? Well, because access to credit became easier with financial deregulation, so consumers could borrow more easily in times of unemployment when the economy was in recession, and they could more effectively smooth their consumption over time. Therefore, consumer credit decreased volatility that came from consumption growth. So supply-side changes contributed to the Great Moderation as well as economic policy. Both rules-based frameworks, monetary targets and inflation targets, seem to have contributed to lower and more stable rates of inflation post the 1980s, as shown on this diagram. So overall, the verdict is that over this more recent period, the rules-based framework for policy did make a contribution to helping to stabilise the macroeconomy. Again, this diagram shows data for the US, but it has been a very similar story in many other developed countries. The similar experiences of different developed countries can be seen on this graph. Here we have GDP growth for Germany, the UK and the US, and in each case it's been low but relatively stable since the late 1980s onwards. The Great Moderation was of course then interrupted by the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009. Some people argued that Hyman Minsky's ideas could explain what had happened. Then Minsky argued that capitalist systems become unstable and fall into times of crisis. He argued that banks want to lend to make a profit, so they start competing for borrowers and invent new kinds of loans for people with less ability to repay. They end up issuing mortgages that are basically a bet that house prices won't fall and that interest rates won't rise. Minsky called it speculative lending. The idea is that because the economy is growing and house prices are rising, the borrowers will be able to sell their houses at a higher price in the future and pay back the loans. So it creates a self-fulfilling upward spiral called a bubble. The bubble ultimately bursts When lenders start getting worried and ask for loans to be repaid, prices start to fall, confidence wanes, and the economy enters into a downward spiral and falls into a recession. So that is, it is argued, what happened in the financial crisis. Financial innovations such as securitization, whereby housing loans were used to make securities that could be bought and sold, that were basically a cocktail of different types of loans, but many of these loans were high risk or subprime loans that were less likely to be repaid. So the Lehman Brothers had bought so many of these securities that it collapsed when homeowners stopped repaying their mortgages. Banks therefore stopped lending to each other because they feared that other banks would also go bust, and they also stopped lending to people who were perfectly capable of repaying, and the whole financial system collapsed. So Minsky's argument was that finance-based capitalism is inherently unstable. There was, however, no repeat of the Great Depression in the 1930s, as shown by the diagram on the left. Unemployment did increase and trade growth slowed, but it was nothing like as dramatic as in the Great Depression. And some argue that this is because policymakers learned the lessons of economic history and did not make the same mistakes that were made in the 1930s. So the left-hand diagram shows the path of the world economy post the financial crisis in red and compares it to the path of the world economy in the time of the Great Depression shown in blue. And you can see they're very similar to each other to begin with, but the recovery started to happen much sooner in the case of the financial crisis. Having said that, the post-crisis recovery has been very disappointing, as shown on the right-hand diagram. So this diagram shows the cumulative change in GDP from the pre-recession peak in the case of the UK. And the red line is the financial crisis, and as you can see, it was an extremely slow recovery compared to previous recessions in the case of the UK. So the performance of the UK economy has been extremely disappointing. Growth in UK productivity over time has been very, very poor, which has become known as the productivity puzzle. So we can see this in the diagram on the left-hand side. The dotted lines show what would have happened if the previous pre-crisis trend had continued, and the solid lines show what has actually happened. And you can see that output per head, which itself determines incomes, would be about 1/5 higher than they are now if we had continued on the pre-crisis trend. So this is part of a story of the very slow recovery post the financial crisis. Why exactly productivity growth has been so slow is a puzzle. This is a live debate taking place among economists, and various different potential explanations have been put forward. Some have argued it's a consequence of austerity, the UK government massively reducing spending in order to reduce the size of the budget deficit. Others have argued it's due to the high levels of debt from the financial crisis. The Bank of England had to bail out the banks. Lots of individuals have high levels of debt, so consumer spending hasn't recovered. Others have argued it's mostly due to demography, so the fact we have an ageing population. There's also long-standing issues surrounding the lack of skills in the economy, not enough finance available for investment, banks preferring to invest in housing, for example, which is safer, and poor infrastructure. So the same old supply side problems that the UK economy has experienced over a long time. And also some people have put forward the idea that the structure of the UK economy is too focused on finance with not enough innovation, especially in the manufacturing sector in the UK. And the innovations that have taken place have not tended to increase productivity. So all of these explanations are possible. So if we look at the data we have now, we can see that we have nothing like the original Phillips curve that policymakers thought existed in the post-war period. Here we have fitted 3 curves to the data, and the green curve is the most recent one, and it shows that the unemployment rate has been varying, but inflation rates have been very low for policy and structural reasons, as we saw earlier. So this new green curve relationship is what we have now, and that is the counterpart to the productivity puzzle. So economists are not entirely sure what is going on in the British economy because we have low unemployment, but also wages are not increasing and prices are not increasing either. So that's the current macroeconomic policy issue for economists to try to resolve. Thank you for watching this web lecture video. Make sure to watch these 2 rap battle videos, which are very funny and summarise the differences in views of Keynes and Hayek.